before the blade ever fell, before the crowd roared, before history reduced her to a single violent image. Marie Antoinette had already been destroyed in a far quieter way, not with steel, but with intention, not with death, but with humiliation. What happened to her before the guillotine was not justice, and it was not mercy. It was something colder, something calculated, a slow erasure of identity, dignity, and humanity, carried out step by step while the world watched and told itself it was necessary. Long before she became a symbol of hatred, she was simply a young woman carried across borders for politics she did not design. Born an Austrian archduchess, married into the French crown as a teenager, she entered Versailles not as a villain, but as a foreign girl trapped inside a golden machine. The palace glittered, yes, but it also suffocated. Every smile was judged, every gesture interpreted, every mistake magnified. She learned quickly that in power, perception matters more than truth. And when famine struck, when debt crushed the nation, when anger needed a face, perception turned into a weapon. By the time the revolution ignited, Marie Antoinette was no longer seen as a person. She had become an idea, a caricature printed on pamphlets, a scapegoat whispered about in markets. The foreign woman, the enemy within. It did not matter what she had done or failed to do. What mattered was that she existed at the center of a collapsing world. And worlds in collapse always look for someone to blame. On the night of August 2nd, 1793, that blame finally reached her cell. In the darkness before dawn, guards entered the temple prison and took her away. There was no explanation, no farewell, no moment of preparation. She was torn from the last fragile remnants of her family and transported through silent streets to the conciergerie, a prison Parisians grimly called the antechamber of death. Once inside, she was no longer a queen. She was prisoner number 280. The conciergerie was not designed to kill bodies quickly. It was designed to break spirits slowly. The cell was damp, narrow, and perpetually cold. Moisture clung to the stone walls and seeped into her clothing. Straw replaced her bed. A single candle replaced the sunlight, and privacy ceased to exist. The guards watched her constantly. She slept under their gaze. She dressed under their gaze. She existed under their gaze. This was not about security. It was about stripping away the final illusion of selfhood. Time lost its meaning inside that cell. There were no clocks, only sounds. The dripping of water, the shuffle of boots, the distant cries of other prisoners being led away, never to return. Outside, Paris raged with revolutionary fervor. Inside, Marie Antoinette learned a new form of silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence forced upon those who were no longer allowed to speak as human beings. The deepest wound, however, had already been inflicted before she arrived. Only weeks earlier, her son had been taken from her. Late at night, guards stormed his room. She had thrown herself over the child, begging, pleading, reminding them that he was only a boy. It made no difference. They tore him from her arms. His screams followed her long after the door closed. She would never see him again. In that moment, something inside her fractured forever. Not the queen, the mother. She carried what little she could into her new prison. A tiny portrait of her son, a lock of his hair hidden in her clothing. These were not symbols of power. They were anchors to sanity, proof that she had once been loved and had loved in return. Her only consistent human contact came from a young servant named Rosalie, who later testified that the former queen only truly broke with speaking of her children. When she did, all pretense fell away. There was no royalty left in her voice, only grief. The guards mocked her. They taunted her with news of her husband's execution. They laughed at her past. Insults were delivered casually, as if cruelty had become routine. But Marie Antoinette did something unexpected. She did not react the way they wanted. She learned to conserve her energy, to speak only when necessary, to move slowly, to reveal nothing. In a place designed to provoke collapse, she cultivated restraint. And restraint, in that environment, became a form of resistance. At night, when the prison finally grew quiet, she would stare at the candle flame and replay her life. The music, the gardens, the children's laughter, and then the slow shift, the resentment, the rumors, the moment when admiration turned into hatred. She searched for the precise instant when she stopped being a person and became a symbol. But there was no single moment. There rarely is. Dehumanization happens gradually, then all at once. 76 days passed this way, 76 mornings without hope. And in that prolonged stripping away, something strange emerged. A composure born not of confidence, but of surrender. When everything is taken from you, fear loses its leverage. There is nothing left to threaten. In October, They came for her again, this time, not to imprison, but to perform justice. The trial was never meant to discover truth. It was meant to confirm a conclusion already reached. The revolutionary tribunal resembled a theater more than a court. Crowds packed the room. Judges sat like statues. The prosecutor spoke not to seek answers, but to inflame. The accusations were sweeping and vague: treason, conspiracy, moral corruption, waste. None of it required proof. Witnesses repeated stories pulled from propaganda. Others invented crimes as they spoke. Facts were irrelevant. Emotion ruled the room. Marie Antoinette listened quietly, responding only when allowed. Her voice was calm, almost distant. Not because she believed she would be spared, but because she understood that outrage would serve no purpose. Then came the accusation designed to annihilate what remained of her humanity. She was accused of incest with her son. The room froze. Even hardened revolutionaries hesitated. The charge was monstrous, and it was deliberate. Her child, broken and manipulated in captivity, had been forced to repeat words he could not understand. It was not enough to kill her. They wanted to poison her memory forever. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stood and turned not to the judges, but to the women in the audience, mothers, workers, the same people who had once marched demanding bread. As she spoke a single sentence, "I appeal to all the mothers who are here." Nothing more was needed. The room shifted. Murmurs spread. For an instant, the caricature collapsed. A mother stood before them, humiliated beyond imagination. The moment passed quickly. The verdict was inevitable: guilty. Death by guillotine. When asked if she had anything to add, she simply replied, "What more could I say?" It was not defeat. It was clarity. That night, back in her cell, she wrote her final letter. Not of anger, not of accusation, but of forgiveness. She begged her sister-in-law to care for her daughter. She asked that her son never be blamed for the words forced upon him. She wrote that even in death, she would remain his mother. The letter was confiscated and hidden for decades. Even her final words were considered dangerous. When morning came, the rituals of degradation resumed. She was forced to change clothes under watch. Her hair was cut with dull scissors. Her hands were bound tightly with rope. Each act was symbolic. Each one said the same thing: "You are no longer who you were." Yet she did not resist. Not because she had accepted their judgment, but because she no longer belonged to it. The cart waited outside, open, exposed. Designed for spectacle, as it moved through the streets of Paris, crowds gathered. Some jeered, some watched in silence. She stood upright, bound, wearing a plain white gown, her hair unevenly shorn. What unsettled the crowd was not her humiliation, but her stillness. She did not perform regret. She did not beg. She did not break. Artists sketched her as she passed. Chroniclers noted her composure. Even those who despised her sensed something they could not name. She had already stepped beyond them. At the scaffold, the noise swelled. The machine loomed, and as she climbed the steps, she stumbled slightly and brushed against the executioner. She turned and apologized. "Forgive me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Those were her last words. No curses, no accusations, an apology. In that moment, stripped of everything, she reclaimed the one thing they could never take: her dignity. The blade fell. The crowd roared, and history moved on. They buried her in a mass grave. No marker, no name. But symbols do not stay buried. Years later, her remains were recovered and given a proper resting place. Her story resurfaced, not as propaganda, but as a warning. Because what was done to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine was not simply punishment. It was a lesson in how easily a society can convince itself that cruelty is righteousness. How quickly a person can be reduced to a symbol. How dangerous it is when anger replaces empathy. She was not innocent of privilege. She was not flawless. But she was human, and in the end, it was not the revolution that judged her most harshly. It was history itself, watching how far people were willing to go once they decided someone no longer deserved to be seen as a person. And that is why her story still echoes, not because of how she died, but because of how she endured.